The night stretched long and dark, heavy with silence that seemed to seep into the walls of the Bennett house. Violet could feel its weight, pressing against her chest like the damp air before a storm. There was a hollowness in her gaze, one that mirrored the churning void inside her. She had been a woman of warmth once, a beacon of grace and kindness, a spirited soul who poured herself into the lives of those she loved. But now she was something else entirely. Loss does that. Grief molds you, reshapes the contours of your mind in ways you cannot resist. It doesn't ask, it takes. And Violet had given everything over to it. Until tonight. There are betrayals that scream in their violence, tearing through the air with unmistakable rage. But then, there are betrayals that sit in the shadows, coiled and quiet, waiting to strike unnoticed. And it was this latter form of treachery that would ultimately shape Violet's path. When her husband Logan whispered his soft reassurances, when her stepbrother Brandon smiled his toothy grin over dinner, she did not see the snakes beneath their masks. No, they called her Dear Violet, painted her as fragile in her sorrow, the grieving widow who could not manage life without their guiding hands. She mistook their kindness for care, a deadly mistake. What would you do with the knowledge that those closest to you, the ones who should be your guardians, your protectors, were sharpening the knives meant to cut you down? What would you do if you learned that the very pillars holding up your world were working silently to pull the foundation from beneath your feet? It wasn't silence that broke her that night, but the words that rose unhidden, unmasked, flowing freely from Logan's mouth into Brandon's ear during a hushed, late-night phone call she wasn't supposed to overhear. She had almost missed it, by mere accident. The call had transmitted onto the auxiliary Bluetooth speaker in the house her husband's fault, a careless slip, and that slip would cost him everything. There's no other way to get her out of the picture. She's mentally unstable. Brandon, the doctors will back the diagnosis. We have the paperwork, she signed it. She's no threat once we move her into care. It was Logan's voice, restrained yet cruel. The kind of calculated confidence that comes with believing you've already won. Violet froze, the sinking cold of realization spreading through her limbs like ice water. Her grip tightened on the counter as Brandon chuckled, his tone smugly conspiratorial. Make sure it's airtight. With her out of the way, we can access the trust fund before the fiscal year's out. If anything happens to her, well, legally, it all goes to you anyway. The bastard didn't leave her a clause protecting her assets. Blindness. That was the word for it. Violet had been utterly blind. Her grief for her late father had consumed her, leaving her vulnerable to manipulation, numb to the red flags she should have seen months ago. But the tide had turned. She sat motionless, her breath uneven as years of suppressed instincts kicked in. Her hands shook not with despair but with rage, a searing fury that boiled over with the single realization they thought her helpless, weak, unthinking, broken. What fools! The kindest face can mask the coldest betrayal. Logan had been patient and deliberate in his cruelty, waiting for the fragility of her mourning to come undone, and Brandon had only been too eager to assist. Their plan to declare her mentally unstable and seize her estate was meticulous, calculated to leave her with nothing but an unbearable prison of gaslit reality, a distorted version of events that would see her alone and powerless in a psychological institution. But Violet wasn't who they thought she was. No, grief hadn't broken her. It had sharpened her edges. You imagine yourself in her place, don't you? Imagine the roaring heartbeat, the desperate urge to act now, to smash the phone where it lay emitting their vile truths, To confront them right there and then? But you shouldn't. Confrontation in moments like these is a mask for fear, and fear is the enemy. Violet knew this without needing to think. Her silence became her armor as she moved quietly through the darkened house, a plan already forming in the deep crease of her brow. There would be no tears, no pleas for explanation. That would have been their victory to see her crumble under their words. No, Violet would not break. She would rise, but not yet. First came strategy. She felt the fragmentation inside her, the wound of betrayal, the ache of love turned weaponized against her. But passion alone cannot reclaim what has been stolen in malice. You know this. If you are wise, you know that revenge should never come from fire. It should come from ice cold, deliberate, cruel in its clarity. And that is where Violet found herself that night, sitting alone in her darkened kitchen, staring blankly at the tablet she held as she replayed the damning audio that would become her weapon. There was no trembling. There was no hesitation. Logan's voice played over and over, each repetition a nail in the coffin of her illusions. But her silence wasn't surrender. It wasn't retreat. It was strategy. They wouldn't see her coming, not until it was too late. Such men believe themselves untouchable, don't they? Wrapped in their illusions of superiority, trusting the systems they've exploited, the laws they've already twisted. But some betrayals birth something unexpected, not weakness, not dissolution, but resolve. Violet would not raise her voice to them, nor would she paint herself as the victim in weeping tones. She would wait, she would plot, and when the moment came, her roar would erase everything they held dear. The office was quiet, too quiet for a Thursday afternoon, in a firm known for its high-stakes legal battles and midnight deadlines. Violet scanned her surroundings with meticulous attention, her breaths shallow but controlled. The polished marble floors reflected muted light from the tall windows, and every step she took echoed against the cavernous silence. She wasn't supposed to be here, yet here she was standing on the precipice of her own war zone. Armed not with brute force, but with the cunning precision of a strategist who had everything to lose. But losing wasn't an option anymore. Failing him, failing Logan, wasn't merely a mistake, but a death sentence for her freedom, her sanity, her future. The plan had been rehearsed to perfection, drilled into her brain until it morphed from uncertainty into muscle memory. Claire's timely phone call had ensured that Logan was away for the afternoon, feigning concern about an urgent family matter to buy Violet just enough time. His secretary guard dog and confidant, Miss Emily with her sharp pencil skirts and sharper tongue, had been conveniently swept into an impromptu meeting downtown. Violet had ensured every variable clicked into place. But still, whispers of paranoia prickled at the edges of her carefully conditioned resolve. The desk was solid mahogany, sprawling and arrogant, mirroring Logan's personality like a caricature of power in physical form. She crouched down, her fingers brushing across the lock of the bottom drawer. Simple, almost insultingly so, too easy to break for a man who prided himself on untouchable security. With quick finesse, Violet unlatched it, revealing a neatly organized tray of documents, each more dangerous than the last. The forged signatures seemed to leap off the paper, screaming vindication for the lies Logan had spun to bind her in legal chains. Insurance policies that triggered payouts upon her incapacity to manage personal affairs. Medical records doctored to diagnose her with a fabricated mental health condition, stabilizing their fraudulent empire of deceit with contrived authority. Every stroke of ink was a nail in her coffin. But today, those nails were hers to pry out. She shot shaky glances over her shoulder, rehearsing her escape route in the back of her mind. Her body wanted to tremble, wanted to scream for release, but Violet's willpower shut it down. Emotion had no place here, not now, not ever during this operation. Her hands moved like a machine as she slipped the incriminating files and records onto the flash drive she'd hidden beneath the lining of her crossbody bag. The program hummed and buzzed unpredictably, dragging seconds into eternity. Every percentage increase was a leap forward toward salvation, though her heart hammered with the knowledge that each passing moment widened the window of danger. From the hallway came voices, muffled and indistinct, but her gut recognized them instantly. Logan, Brandon. Her chest constricted in raw panic, but her focus refused to break, quickly but deliberately. Violet shut the drawer back into its pristine facade, slipping into the shadowed corner behind a filing cabinet. The sound grew louder, jagged pieces of their conversation sneaking through the haze of her adrenaline. "She's weak," Logan spat, his tone carrying that unrelenting disdain that had haunted her for the past year more effectively than the drugs he'd insisted she take. Bleeding heart. Claire still thinks I'll handle this cleanly, but it won't last another week. Violet's going to unravel sooner or later. Just keep your role locked down. Don't make me fix your screw-ups again. Brandon snickered in response, his ego amplified by Logan's contemptuous confidence. "Relax. By the time she figures it out, she'll be someone else's problem. No problem losing what's already broken, right?" Broken. The word scorched Violet's insides like a brand, a reminder of how thoroughly their lies had warped her reality. They weren't planning just to control her, they planned to obliterate her agency, her existence, quietly, permanently. Something primal flared inside her, battling the surgical precision of her mind, but she reined it in, lest she betray even a whisper of her presence. Revenge isn't just rage, it's patience weaponized. Pain converted into the fuel of genius. She couldn't afford to stumble now. She wouldn't afford it. The footsteps receded until the hallway swallowed them whole again, but their implications hung heavy in her chest. There wasn't time to linger. The stolen evidence now burned a hole in her pocket. She slipped out from her hiding spot, cautious but commanding, unfurling her escape as deftly as she'd unraveled Logan's buried treachery. Exiting through the side stairwell, Violet inhaled sharply but didn't exhale until the rush of street noise drowned her lingering tension. That was too close, but she was out. And now, she wasn't just surviving anymore, she was winning. It wasn't vengeance that drove her, not really. It was reclamation, a reclamation of dignity, power, autonomy. The flash drive in her possession was the first slate of truth in a puzzle painted by his lies. And Violet intended to keep building until Logan couldn't just lose, until he would never recover in the eyes of the world he worshipped. The office was quiet, too quiet for a Thursday afternoon, in a firm known for its high-stakes legal battles and midnight deadlines. Violet scanned her surroundings with meticulous attention, her breaths shallow but controlled. The polished marble floors reflected muted light from the tall windows, and every step she took echoed against the cavernous silence. She wasn't supposed to be here, yet here she was standing on the precipice of her own war zone. Armed not with brute force, but with the cunning precision of a strategist who had everything to lose. But losing wasn't an option anymore. Failing him, failing Logan, wasn't merely a mistake, but a death sentence for her freedom, her sanity, her future. The plan had been rehearsed to perfection, drilled into her brain until it morphed from uncertainty into muscle memory. Claire's timely phone call had ensured that Logan was away for the afternoon, feigning concern about an urgent family matter to buy Violet just enough time. His secretary guard dog and confidant, Miss Emily with her sharp pencil skirts and sharper tongue, had been conveniently swept into an impromptu meeting downtown. Violet had ensured every variable clicked into place, but still, whispers of paranoia prickled at the edges of her carefully conditioned resolve. The desk was solid mahogany, sprawling and arrogant, mirroring Logan's personality like a caricature of power in physical form. She crouched down, her fingers brushing across the lock of the bottom drawer. Simple, almost insultingly so. Too easy to break for a man who prided himself on untouchable security. With quick finesse, Violet unlatched it, revealing a neatly organized tray of documents, each more dangerous than the last. The forged signatures seemed to leap off the paper, screaming vindication for the lies Logan had spun to bind her in legal chains. Insurance policies that triggered payouts upon her incapacity to manage personal affairs. Medical records doctored to diagnose her with a fabricated mental health condition, stabilizing their fraudulent empire of deceit with contrived authority. Every stroke of ink was a nail in her coffin. But today, those nails were hers to pry out. She shot shaky glances over her shoulder, rehearsing her escape route in the back of her mind. Her body wanted to tremble, wanted to scream for release, but Violet's willpower shut it down. Emotion had no place here, not now, not ever during this operation. Her hands moved like a machine as she slipped the incriminating files and records onto the flash drive she'd hidden beneath the lining of her crossbody bag. The program hummed and buzzed unpredictably, dragging seconds into eternity. Every percentage increase was a leap forward toward salvation, though her heart hammered with the knowledge that each passing moment widened the window of danger. From the hallway came voices, muffled and indistinct, but her gut recognized them instantly. Logan, Brandon. Her chest constricted in raw panic, but her focus refused to break, quickly but deliberately. Violet shut the drawer back into its pristine facade, slipping into the shadowed corner behind a filing cabinet. The sound grew louder, jagged pieces of their conversation sneaking through the haze of her adrenaline. "She's weak," Logan spat, his tone carrying that unrelenting disdain that had haunted her for the past year more effectively than the drugs he'd insisted she take. Bleeding heart. "Claire still thinks I'll handle this cleanly, but it won't last another week. Violet's going to unravel sooner or later. Just keep your role locked down. Don't make me fix your screw-ups again." Brandon snickered in response, his ego amplified by Logan's contemptuous confidence. "Relax. By the time she figures it out, she'll be someone else's problem. No problem losing what's already broken, right?" Broken. The word scorched Violet's insides like a brand, a reminder of how thoroughly their lies had warped her reality. They weren't planning just to control her, they planned to obliterate her agency, her existence, quietly, permanently. Something primal flared inside her, battling the surgical precision of her mind, but she reined it in, lest she betray even a whisper of her presence. Revenge isn't just rage, it's patience weaponized, pain converted into the fuel of genius. She couldn't afford to stumble now, she wouldn't afford it. The footsteps receded until the hallway swallowed them whole again, but their implications hung heavy in her chest. There wasn't time to linger, the stolen evidence now burned a hole in her pocket. She slipped out from her hiding spot, cautious but commanding, unfurling her escape as deftly as she'd unraveled Logan's buried treachery. Exiting through the side stairwell, Violet inhaled sharply, but didn't exhale until the rush of street noise drowned her lingering tension. That was close, too close, but she was out. And now, she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was winning. It wasn't vengeance that drove her, not really. It was reclamation, a reclamation of dignity, power, autonomy. The flash drive in her possession was the first slate of truth in a puzzle painted by his lies. And Violet intended to keep building until Logan couldn't just lose, until he would never recover in the eyes of the world he worshipped. Violet stared out into the dense expanse of pines surrounding the cabin, their jagged silhouettes carved against the bleeding hues of dusk. In the quiet, she felt the weight of her decision settling like sediment at the bottom of her chest. Disappearing hadn't been easy emotionally or logistically, but it was necessary. Unlike the chaos of the city where Logan thrived, this secluded refuge offered clarity. The cabin, tucked near the Wisconsin border, was a gift from Claire's late grandfather. It wasn't grand or sophisticated, just functional and anonymous, the kind of place you could vanish into without leaving a trace. Violet hadn't been there before, but walking inside, it felt strangely familiar. Perhaps because it symbolized her transition, a gateway from victimhood to power. 3 days. That's how long she needed to stay invisible, relying on Claire and Rebecca Black, her pulverizing, no-nonsense lawyer, to barricade Logan's shiny empire before he realized the walls were crumbling. The legal motions were already being prepared, insidious in their precision, freezing his assets and countering the guardianship petitions concocted to strip her of autonomy. Rebecca's confidence was contagious, but Violet knew strength wasn't just projected, it had to be cultivated. Alone in the cabin, she had the rare opportunity to dive into that process, to reconcile the pneumatic ache of betrayal with something sharper, something that could dismantle Logan's towering hubris. The air inside was cold but clean. Violet boiled a kettle for tea, its whistle cutting through the silence like a sharp knife. Sitting down at the creaky dining table, she pulled the flash drive from the inner pocket of her jacket and placed it in front of her. It was astonishing how small it was, physically insignificant, yet weighty enough to crush Logan's ambitions. On that drive was the culmination of weeks of clandestine actions, fabricated insurance claims, altered mental health documents, records of Logan and Brandon funneling money through shell corporations, a web of deceit carefully spun, now dangling precariously above the flames Violet intended to ignite. Psychologists often talk about revenge in terms of maladaptive coping mechanisms, a fruitless attempt at restoring a sense of control. And truthfully, it does often spiral into toxicity. But for Violet, this wasn't about spiraling. It wasn't even about rage. No, what drove her now was the need for balance, to restore equilibrium where there had only been exploitation and manipulation. Logan hadn't just betrayed her, he had reduced her to a pawn, a disposable fragment of his grand financial schemes. What she wanted wasn't retaliation, it was reclamation, not of money or prestige, but of herself. But here's the strange thing no one tells you when you stare betrayal in the face. Its ugliness is often dwarfed by self-doubt. Sitting alone in the cabin, Violet felt that doubt creeping up like frost on a window pane. You'd resist, wouldn't you? You'd tell yourself you're strong enough to smash through that glass, to keep staring ahead. But doubt doesn't fight fair. It twists your weakest insecurities into narratives you can almost believe. Was she going too far? Should she have just escaped quietly, cut her losses, and rebuilt her life in obscurity? What if Logan managed to weasel his way out of this, leaving her humiliated, stranded? You're asking those questions now too, aren't you? Because revenge feels good in theory, but in practice, there's risk, moral ambiguity, and an unsettling awareness It might cost you more than you bargained for. But Violet wasn't bargaining not anymore. She had already gambled everything on Logan's ability to care about her, to honor their vows, to protect her instead of prey on her naivety. There was no currency left for her to spend. What remained was strategy, pure, meticulous execution. The key was staying invisible, and Violet had hedged everything on Rebecca's ability to act as her shield during this interim blackout. Rebecca had already filed motions with the state to freeze Logan's accounts, citing his fraudulent manipulation of Violet's alleged mental instability and her assets. Logan wouldn't know what hit him until it was too late, a financial chokehold that would undo years of his calculated smarm. But money wasn't the point. It never was. For Violet, this was about creating consequences Logan couldn't charm, bully, or litigate his way out of. At the crackle of approaching tires on the gravel outside, Violet stiffened. She reached for the knife near the edge of the counter, a reflex she hadn't anticipated but trusted, and waited for the sound to clarify itself. It was Claire, her sister-in-law, returning from her latest trip to the nearest town for groceries and burner phone SIM cards. Violet exhaled as the front door creaked open, the tension in her shoulders easing. "You all right?" Claire asked, carefully studying her face as she carried 2 brown paper bags inside. "Getting there," Violet replied, the words hollow but honest. Claire didn't press further. Her allegiance to Violet now ran deep, anchored by the empathetic outrage she felt toward her brother's monstrous betrayal. Quietly, Claire unpacked the groceries, arranging instant soups and basic snacks on the old kitchen counter. Violet appreciated the thoughtfulness, the insistence on normalcy despite chaos looming like storm clouds overhead. That evening, sitting on the worn-out couch near the cabin's wood-burning stove, Violet allowed herself a moment of simple reflection. In some parts of her mind, there was still warmth, memories of laughter shared with Logan, the gentle touch of his hand resting on hers during long, lazy weekends. None of it felt real anymore. But Violet didn't mourn what she had lost, not the marriage, not the illusions. What she mourned, quietly and briefly, was how willing she had been to believe. That would be the hardest wound to heal, but it wouldn't stop her. For Violet, this wasn't just survival anymore. It was transformation, the rebirth of someone who refused to stay in the shadows of another's oppressive schemes. And as she stared into the flickering shadows cast by the fire, she knew this was only the beginning. The engine of destruction began to hum softly the day Violet Bennett decided she would no longer play the victim in a game orchestrated by men who mistook her kindness for weakness. In the weeks prior, she had unraveled the threads of their treachery, her husband Logan's betrayal, interwoven with the gleeful complicity of his stepbrother Brandon. Together, they had schemed, manipulating her grief and fragile emotional state as their weapon. The audacity to label her as unstable, to dismiss her as nothing more than a fragile shell they could easily overpower, it fueled a fire that would burn until their own empire of deceit was reduced to ash. Violet's decision to stage her death was the crescendo of her rebellion, a performance so masterful it would leave her enemies blinded by their hubris. It was not merely about success, it was about stripping them bare of their illusions, forcing them to choke on their overconfidence. Violet had no intention of crafting a flimsy facade. A mere disappearance wouldn't suffice. Her false demise had to be undeniable, unquestionable, meticulously stitched together with precision that even Logan's connections within law enforcement couldn't unravel. She enlisted Claire, her sister-in-law, and now her fiercest ally, whose ability to compartmentalize fear under the guise of calm professionalism made her indispensable. Claire introduced Violet to an old contact from her college years, Isaac Moreno, a forensic investigator with questionable ethics, but an unwavering sense of loyalty to those he deemed deserving. Isaac, intrigued by Violet's tale, and perhaps sensing the gravity of her conviction, agreed to secure the necessary documentation to make her fraudulent death official, leveraging his ties to the local coroner's office. On the evening of the staged accident, the cliffside was cloaked in silence, save for the distant hum of waves gnawing at the jagged rocks below. Violet had spent hours rehearsing every move, every detail, ensuring that her fabricated demise would withstand scrutiny. The car keys she left in the ignition, the shards of her shattered phone conspicuously placed near the edge. They were all deliberate breadcrumbs, pieces of evidence to be discovered, analyzed, and confirmed by Logan himself. More importantly, they weren't just props. They were weapons, tools to manipulate the narrative, to orchestrate her enemy's darkest impulses, and expose them for the treacherous men they truly were. Claire drove Violet away from the carefully curated scene just before midnight, her hands trembling slightly around the wheel. Violet didn't speak during that ride. She didn't need to. Her eyes, fixed on the dark horizon, spoke volumes of resolve. When they reached the secluded cabin where Violet would be hiding, Isaac was waiting, his laptop already connected to hidden cameras on site. Everything was set in motion, and the cabin became her sanctuary as she awaited the fallout. It wasn't comfort she sought here. Comfort had long been burned away alongside the naive illusions of who Logan once pretended to be. The only thing that mattered now was endurance, seeing the plan through, no matter the sleepless nights, the gnawing hunger, the relentless whispers of doubt. This was transformation at its most brutal. She wasn't merely disappearing. She was erasing every trace of the woman who could be deceived. And the deception worked brilliantly. It was almost grotesque how quickly Logan and Brandon celebrated their supposed victory. Violet had anticipated their arrogance, but hadn't fully prepared herself for the visceral disgust that flooded her chest as she watched them through hidden cameras. Their laughter echoed cruelly in her ears, their smug remarks dripping with self-congratulation. They toasted her demise with expensive whiskey pilfered from her estate, the audacity of men who thought they had won. Violet watched as Logan leaned back, a self-satisfied grin splitting his face as he spoke words that would later serve as the linchpin for his ruin. They spoke with reckless abandon, unveiling the depths of their conspiracy without hesitation. The falsification of documents, the forged medical evaluations, the life insurance policies newly acquired under her name, everything she had suspected was laid bare in their unguarded arrogance. But what Logan and Brandon failed to acknowledge was the unrelenting persistence of the one they thought they had defeated. Violet wasn't listening to their confessions for closure or catharsis. She was listening to craft their undoing. Every word, every boastful slip, was meticulously recorded as Isaac sat beside her reviewing the live feeds. The recordings weren't just evidence, they were slivers of justice waiting to be wielded. It was brutal, psychological warfare using their own depraved satisfaction against them. Violet felt no remorse watching them implicate themselves deeper with every glass of whiskey they poured. She wanted them to feel the sting of exposure, the sharp edges of the consequences they had so brazenly ignored. The revelation of her fake death spread quickly, stirring a storm of condolences and whispers throughout Logan's carefully constructed social circle. Yet Violet remained undetected behind layers of deception, shielded by Claire's unwavering support and Isaac's expertise. Her silence made them bold, careless, incapable of taming their own gloating as they solidified their plans to split her fortune. Logan prepared to liquidate assets once the dust settled, believing himself safe in the impenetrable cloak of her presumed death. But Violet was far from done. Watching their final moments of twisted celebration only sharpened her focus. What they had underestimated wasn't her intelligence, but her sheer fortitude. This wasn't just the clawing ascent of survival, it was the calculated, methodical dismantling of an empire born from betrayal. Violet wanted them to taste defeat as intimately as they had savored their fabricated triumph. Revenge wasn't a selfish indulgence for her, it was a cleansing act, one that would reset the scales they had spent years tilting in their favor. And as she replayed the recordings with Isaac, preparing them for the legal avalanche to come, Violet knew, with unshakable certainty, that their arrogance was the very hand that would pull them into the abyss. As Logan and Brandon descended deeper into their constructed facade of grief following Violet's supposed death, federal authorities quietly mobilized, guided by the wealth of evidence she and her allies had painstakingly collected. It was a web woven with the precision of someone who had stared into the abyss of betrayal and refused to flinch. Violet understood the weight of her own silence during those days of invisibility, knowing it would be the same silence that Logan and Brandon would soon confront not as a shield this time, but as the ominous void that foretold their downfall. The arrests were simultaneous, timed to bring maximum disruption to the empire they had greedily crafted in her absence. Logan's office was bustling with activity when federal agents entered, their presence a jarring contrast against the polished rows of legal assistants and framed certificates. They offered him no courtesy, no delay, simply reading the indictment aloud as his colleagues stood frozen around him. Brandon's apprehension unfolded differently, but no less humiliating at a restaurant where he had been attempting to close a deal under Logan's direction. His arrogance melted into confusion as agents handcuffed him, diners whispering and pointing as the raw spectacle of his arrest filled the room. The days of considering themselves untouchable were over. They had gambled everything on Violet's presumed weakness, only to find themselves ensnared by her resilience. The trial became a theater of reckoning, a public unmasking of men who had weaponized trust and intimacy for personal gain. Violet didn't just provide testimony, she commanded it. Her voice, steady and unyielding, conveyed the betrayal she had endured without allowing herself to be framed as a victim. Holding the courtroom in her grip, she methodically laid out the evidence, a timeline of forgery, falsified records, and plotted murder, leaving no shadow for Logan and Brandon to retreat into. Video recordings of their confessions played on screens larger than life, reminding everyone present of the gloating audacity that had propelled them forward. As the footage completed its uninterrupted run, Violet finally met Logan's eyes in that room. What she saw there wasn't defiance, it was fracture. Isaac's role in falsifying her psychiatric diagnosis, bolstered by the corrupt psychiatrist Dr. Whitmore, proved just as damning. Witnesses from clinics were brought in, their testimonies exposing Isaac's unprecedented breach of ethics. The psychiatrist's involvement with Logan had gone far beyond mere paperwork manipulation. His active assistance in labeling Violet as mentally unfit was the linchpin of their entire scheme. Violet's legal team connected Whitmore's entanglements to other cases as well, an investigation that opened more doors than Logan could have foreseen. The prosecution wielded her evidence with surgical precision, slicing away at the narrative Logan and Brandon attempted to construct in their defense. Every lie they spoke was countered with material proof, every false rebuttal dismantled by forensic data. Logan and Brandon faced sentencing with the same empty bravado that had carried them through the conspiracy. But arrogance doesn't hold weight in a courtroom backed by irrefutable evidence. 25 years for Logan, 20 years for Brandon. And as if it were a poetic echo, a decade in federal custody for Dr. Whitmore, his license permanently revoked, his freedom forever tainted by the gravity of his crimes. Violet didn't celebrate the sentences when they were read aloud. She simply nodded, acknowledging the restoration of balance where chaos had once reigned. Justice wasn't just served, it was redefined as an act of methodical calculation, stripped of impulsive rage or emotion. It was the raw result of choosing fortitude over surrender. In the midst of legal chaos, Violet endured questions about her own psychological state, as much a remnant of Logan's deliberate slander as societal tendencies to doubt women in positions of vulnerability. Defense lawyers tried to twist her resilience into suspicion, arguing that her alleged emotional volatility painted her as unreliable. But Violet didn't falter. Every word out of her mouth carried the weight of logic, precision, and self-possession. The courtroom became a testament to her unyielding refusal to conform to the image her betrayers hoped to perpetuate. She was not fragile, not hysterical, not unhinged. She was the architect of their ruin. Logan's crooked empire crumbled under scrutiny. The financial holdings he had maneuvered so desperately to protect dissolved into the legal abyss of seized assets and restitution orders. Brandon's role as a willing accomplice earned him no favors, his share of corrupt deals becoming evidence against him. The aftermath saw years of dissection policies rewritten, precedents re-examined, loopholes closed. Violet, though battered by the journey, carried the fight beyond the walls of the courthouse and into broader conversations about psychological abuse and systemic dismissal of victims in legal frameworks. Despite achieving justice, Violet found no triumph in destruction alone. She recognized that revenge, though cleansing, could not rebuild the parts of her life Logan had tried to break. The courtroom drama offered closure, but not healing that would demand something deeper. And perhaps the most empowering part of Violet's transformation lay in her refusal to let the courtroom define her. Legal victories are fleeting, tied to laws that bend and reshape with time. But resilience, she had learned, was eternal. So, she chose not just to survive, she chose to thrive. As Violet Bennett stood at the crossroads of her shattered past and an uncertain future, the specter of trauma continued to haunt her. The courtroom victory, decisive as it was, did not immediately free her from the weight of betrayal or the lingering shadows of manipulation. Justice had been meted out, yes, but it was her mind and her heart that demanded the most grueling form of healing. Violet had spent years suffocating in Logan's web of control, his calculated deceit poisoning every intimate moment of her life. The struggle that followed was not entirely unexpected, but no less exhausting. Severing ties with a man determined to implode her existence meant disentangling from the emotional wreckage all on her own. Revenge, as satisfying as it might appear from the outside, isn't a cure, it's a release. And the emptiness left behind can swallow even the strongest among us. Violet resisted the obvious solutions. Therapy was out of the question. The betrayal had carved too deep a gash. Trusting someone with her vulnerable reality, especially in a clinical setting, felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. Logan had weaponized the medical establishment against her, orchestrating false claims of mental instability and coercing corrupt professionals to validate them. Now, even the sight of a waiting room brought bile to her throat. The idea of sharing her secrets with another therapist filled her with revulsion. To recover, she would have to forge her own path, a journey riddled with obstacles. unlit by traditional methods of treatment. For months, Violet struggled to breathe in her own skin. Everywhere she went, echoes of the past flooded her senses, choking her with memories she couldn't silence: the smirking faces of Logan and Brandon, their whispered plans to dismantle her, the cold, sterile courtroom where her sanity was put on trial. Emerging from revenge often means reckoning with the aftermath more than the act. It wasn't about proving something anymore. It was about reclaiming the pieces of herself, intertwining with the debris of betrayal. Some days, she wasn't sure where Violet ended and Logan's manipulation began. Anxiety tethered her to sleepless nights, and trust, well, that felt as though it no longer existed in her vocabulary. Trust was what shattered her life in the first place. Why gamble it again? But Violet's transformative journey took an unexpected turn with a surprising ally. Dr. Camille Asher, a trauma specialist whose reputation preceded her, entered Violet's world at Claire's, urging the sister-in-law who had saved her life in more ways than one. Camille's approach wasn't textbook. She didn't sit Violet down in a dimly lit room or push worksheets across sterile desks. Instead, her focus lingered on connections and empowerment. At their first meeting, she didn't interrogate Violet about her past or whether she had forgiven her abusers. Camille understood that survivors often needed more than healing, they needed purpose. Violet needed a reason to believe she wasn't alone amidst her quiet suffering. Their conversations were direct yet refreshing. Camille spoke not of closure in abstract terms, but of power reclaimed. She urged Violet to channel her pain into something actionable. Violet's story, harrowing as it was, held a blueprint that others could learn from. Despite her reluctance to open up, the idea planted seeds in Violet's mind. Camille didn't ask her to revisit her trauma. If she wasn't ready, she merely suggested that the cracks in Violet's foundation could be mended by lifting others. And so, the concept of advocacy began flickering to life. With Camille's guidance, Violet delved into research. There was no shortage of victims whose lives spiraled after psychological abuse. Many had far fewer resources or support than Violet herself. They were abandoned by families who believed the lies, dismissed by courts indifferent to emotional manipulation, and ostracized by communities that trivialized non-physical abuse. The stories she uncovered ignited fury, but also resolve. Violet wasn't alone, and neither were they. Her revenge against Logan and Brandon could transform into something enduring, not just punishment, but prevention. Weeks turned into months, and her advocacy group for victims of psychological abuse was born not in a boardroom or at an official nonprofit, but around her kitchen table in Chicago. It began with small gatherings, women scattered across Chicago, land sharing their stories. Each meeting ended with tangible plans to create change petitions for reforms, public awareness campaigns, and legal advice for those facing their own entanglements of lies. Slowly, Violet's perspective shifted. Revenge, she realized, didn't have to begin and end with destruction. It could expand, ripple outward, become something far greater. The work began rekindling hope and, yes, trust. Violet saw courage in every tearful retelling, determination in the women who refused to let shame silence them. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, survivors, and they were reclaiming the narrative that was stolen from them. Violet, too, felt herself changing. The jagged pieces inside her were slowly reassembling. Trust wasn't something to offer blindly, but it wasn't impossible. She discovered it in these women, found it in Camille's unwavering support, even began fostering it within herself. Revenge had been her catalyst, and healing was her destination. But empowerment became her legacy. The foundation of her advocacy grew roots Violet had never dared imagine. For someone who once believed her life had been reduced to ashes, these moments marked the rebirth of something much stronger than survival. It was unyielding. It was thriving. Violet Bennett stood on the stage beneath the glare of the auditorium lights, her presence commanding the attention of hundreds gathered to witness history. This was not the culmination of a simple journey, but an odyssey forged in betrayal, survival, and ultimately, transformation. Her words carried the weight of experience, the scars of emotional warfare, yet also the promise of hope for those still trapped in the labyrinth of psychological abuse. The Violet Bennett Foundation had become more than an organization. It was an unstoppable force, a beacon for those desperate to regain autonomy over their lives. Chicago had been the battleground where Violet first confronted the depths of deception that gutted her existence. Now, it served as the birthplace of her advocacy, a phoenix rising from the ashes of humiliation and suffering. Her foundation wasn't conceived out of vengeance, though it undeniably echoed the resolve that had brought down Logan and Brandon. It was about dismantling the systems of manipulation that enabled monsters like them to thrive. What began as a modest support group for survivors burgeoned into an intricate network of counselors, legal experts, and financial planners working synchronously to pull victims from the quicksand of psychological abuse. Behind every statistic, there was human anguish. For every successful intervention, a previously silenced voice emerged to recount hard truths. Violet's foundation gave these truths a megaphone. One such truth was embodied by Elena, a mother of 3 who came to Violet with hollow cheeks and trembling hands after escaping a marriage riddled with gaslighting and financial coercion. Her husband had her believing she was a failure, a deadweight liability who couldn't survive independently. His power over her was so insidious that even after breaking free, she felt shackled by the ghost of his control. Violet personally connected Elena to Camille, ensuring targeted therapy sessions that restored her confidence and reframed her narrative not as a victim, but as a fighter reclaiming her agency. Within months, Elena managed to secure a stable job, eventually joining the foundation herself as an advocate for other women. Her resilience became a cornerstone of Violet's message, the proof that change was possible when the right resources were applied. Of course, change wasn't always a smooth arc. Violet learned early that combating psychological abuse required not only dedication, but relentless advocacy across every sphere, personal, legal, and cultural. That's where the Bennett Act came into play. Her courtroom victories and intimate stories, shared openly with policymakers, coalesced into something monumental. The federal legislation would mandate stringent penalties for perpetrators while introducing mandatory education programs for first responders, social workers, and even school counselors. Violet believed that prevention was just as vital as intervention. If people understood manipulation tactics, if they were given the tools to recognize emotional abuse at its infancy, the cycle could be broken in its earliest stages. This vision extended to the educational initiatives spearheaded by the Foundation. In partnership with local universities, they began training law enforcement on the nuanced signs of coercion and psychological exploitation. Seminars were held for judges who had dismissed cases of emotional manipulation as frivolous or unprovable. Financial workshops emerged for victims, teaching them how to safeguard their assets and recover from economic sabotage. Violet didn't stop there. She took her message to corporations and HR teams, outlining the toxic dynamics of workplace abuse that often mirrored the same power struggles found in intimate relationships. Her tenacity ensured that systemic change wasn't confined to one sphere, but radiated outward in all directions. As years passed, the foundation evolved into a sprawling network responsible for influencing countless lives. The stories that poured in reaffirmed her purpose. There was Lena, the artist whose creative spark had been systematically extinguished by her domineering partner until she rediscovered her voice with the help of the Foundation's support group. And Yusuf, a young man who uncovered the emotional manipulation underpinning his father's authoritarian rule, finally freeing himself from the shadows of generational trauma. Violet often received letters, some penned with shaky hands, others bearing deliberate, forceful strokes, all thanking her not just for the resources, but for the belief that survival could morph into empowerment. These letters became her fuel, reminding her that her war against cruelty was far from finished. Violet's vision wasn't confined to healing individuals. It targeted the oppressive systems that enabled psychological abusers. She began collaborating with whistleblowers and investigative journalists to unravel deeply ingrained power structures. One groundbreaking project exposed the unregulated private counseling networks where predatory therapists exploited vulnerable patients, a haunting parallel to the psychiatrist who had colluded in Logan's betrayal. Violet armed herself with data, statistics, and testimony from survivors, paving the way for stricter licensing protocols and ethical standards in the therapeutic industry. The scope of her work attracted attention beyond the nation's borders. In countries with little protection against psychological abuse, her foundation became a model for advocacy campaigns tackling gender violence and coercion tactics within communities that viewed abuse as private or trivial matters. But while others marveled at the breadth of her influence, Violet never lost sight of her beginnings, the close confines of that Chicago apartment where she first discovered Logan's treachery. She never forgot the hollow pang in her chest when she realized her life had been systematically shredded under a manipulative fist. That memory didn't haunt her, it ignited her. Walking off the stage that night, Violet felt the weight of her mission settle into something resolute. Her foundation had reshaped society's understanding of psychological abuse, proving that intangible wounds were just as devastating as physical ones. The fight wasn't over. She knew there would always be wolves lurking in plain sight, preying on those who doubted their own worth. But as long as Violet Bennett had breath in her body, she'd ensure those wolves would meet resistance unyielding, fortified, and fierce. Empowerment wasn't simply a legacy she left behind. It was a continuum she ensured lived on in the minds and hearts of survivors who dared to reclaim their stories. Dr. Whitmore had emerged from the shadows like an insidious ghost, a figure Violet thought she would never cross paths with again. The disgraced psychiatrist, stripped of his medical license and sent to prison for his role in Logan's bitter scheme, had slipped back into the world with an uncanny ability to reinvent his depravity. His name resurfaced when whispers of fraud began to saturate the quiet suburban neighborhoods of Illinois. Elderly women alone, vulnerable, and trusting had somehow fallen prey to an elaborate scheme. They were losing their life savings under the guise of treatments, documents, and lawsuits they neither understood nor needed. It didn't take Violet long to connect the dots. After all, predators rarely stray far from the scent of desperation, but this time was different. Whitmore wasn't just exploiting. He was building a network, one of coercion, manipulation, and legally dashed hopes. This wasn't simply exploitation for profit. It was calculated warfare against the powerless, a scheme engineered with the cold precision of someone who had spent years justifying their own moral decay. It was Violet's understanding of power, how it overwhelms, how it recalibrates the psyche into submission, that made her act before grief overtook the fragile lives of these strangers. She tracked stories, studied patterns, and uncovered Whitmore's fingerprints on every fraudulent transaction. But there was a piece missing, something that would unravel his operation to its foundation and not just stop him, but obliterate any remnants of the system he had revived like a parasitic vine. That missing piece led her to Rachel Whitmore, a woman cloaked in her own veil of secrecy and scars. Rachel wasn't just Whitmore's estranged daughter. She was his collateral damage, a walking testament to decades of systematic psychological warfare by the man who had rebranded himself as society's friend. Rachel had spent years rebuilding her life in anonymity, severing ties to her father with the type of finality that only a survivor knows. It was Violet's choice of words, her deliberate and visceral recounting of Whitmore's new victims, that peeled back Rachel's reluctance and introduced something far more potent: rage. When Violet and Rachel finally sat in the bare confines of a coffee shop tucked on the north side of Chicago, their conversation was subtle but electric. Violet saw in Rachel an ally, a survivor with knowledge and skills that could bring this criminal enterprise tumbling down. But Rachel didn't initially see herself that way. What she saw was a fractured woman hoping to stay invisible from the bloom of her father's manipulations. Still, Violet spoke to her not as a victim, but as something far greater, someone who could be the decryptor, the insider, the weapon needed to end this madness once and for all. Violet's carefully chosen arguments weren't just bait, they were a mirror, offering Rachel a reflection of her own power, dormant but potent. The plan shifted instantly when Rachel agreed to join. It was no longer just Violet meticulously collecting evidence, it was an operation. Rachel's connection to Whitmore's past gave the system meaning, provided insight into where the cracks existed. Together, they mapped Whitmore's financial network, traced fraudulent insurance claims, and found the lifeblood of his schemes hidden in unwieldy contracts designed to confuse anyone trying to untangle them. Hours melted into days as Violet and Rachel dove deep into the web Whitmore had spun. They uncovered shells of companies, offshore accounts, and intimidating letters sent under the guise of law firms that didn't exist. Every detail led to something bigger, something undeniable. But this wasn't just about discovery, it was about execution. Violet knew firsthand that justice unprepared was justice delayed. She leaned heavily on Rachel's anger, sharp, justified, and catalytic to give these fragile victims their first line of defense. Violet contacted lawyers she had worked with during Logan's trial, pieced together notebooks of their findings, and built alliances with local authorities eager to take down such a vile network. The momentum grew with every connection uncovered, and every victim pulled from the brink of financial ruin added another pillar of strength to their case. This wasn't just about Violet avenging her past, it was about her proving that predators never operate in isolation. They thrive in silence. The turning point came unexpectedly when Whitmore, emboldened by his success, slipped into the public eye to expand his reach. A seminar marketed as an empowerment retreat for widows revealed everything Violet and Rachel needed to bring his empire to its knees. It was there, under false promises of healing and prosperity. Where Whitmore made his most arrogant mistake, he implicated himself openly through video recordings obtained by an undercover informant. His words weren't just coercive, they were damning. And Violet knew the value of undeniable proof. The arrest of Dr. Whitmore wasn't quiet. Federal agents swarmed his rented office space while Rachel stood invisible in the background, watching the culmination of her father's twisted legacy implode on live news feeds. Violet, however, knew this wasn't just about removing Whitmore from society. She pushed for systemic change. The exposure of his schemes rippled across media outlets, forcing legislative reviews of elder protection laws. Their case strengthened national regulation frameworks, making it nearly impossible for others like Whitmore to thrive under the veil of legality again. Rachel wasn't the same woman she'd been at the coffee shop. She emerged from the shadows victorious, not just over her father, but over every lie and manipulation she had internalized for years. Violet watched with satisfied resolve. This wasn't just closure, this was reclamation. Whitmore was sentenced to permanent incarceration, his network dismantled, and his victims freed from the financial chains he had placed upon them. Violet understood the value of this, of giving survivors the tools not just to survive but to fight back. It was her masterwork, her vow to herself and to every person touched by neglect and malice. Because wolves like Whitmore didn't just deserve consequences. They deserved extinction, delivered piece by calculated piece, until nothing remained of the systems that enabled them. The room was quiet now, impossibly still. The courthouse echoes had long faded, and so had the storm of voices, accusations, and proclamations that once swirled around Violet Bennett. She stood in her home, a space made vast by the silence, watching the light change as it spilled through large windows, indifferent to her victories. There'd been no grand celebration, no champagne corks flying into the metaphorical air of her life. Justice had been decisive, brutal in its clarity, yet it left behind a vacuum that was more sobering than triumphant. Logan sat in the cage his own greed constructed. Brandon lost in the labyrinth of his own downfall, and others' pieces of their machinery dismantled brick by despicable brick. But even in their absence, their shadows clung to the creases of Violet's mind like forgotten fingerprints. She'd arrived here, on the other side of devastation, not through catharsis but through grinding effort, pushing forward when her body demanded collapse. And now, she looked at the empty chair by the fireplace, the one Logan used to claim after swearing he loved her, and she thought only of how hollow such love truly was. Hollow promises, hollow people. Every betrayal had stripped her down, layer by layer, leaving her not raw but sharpened, a blade tempered by her suffering. Yet somehow, at the sharpest edge of her pain, she'd found softness too, a softness that didn't pity her adversaries, but pitied the weakness that consumed them. Whitmore, Logan, Brandon, all of them had been wolves dressed poorly as men, ravenous in their desire but empty at their core. Power wasn't their prize. Money wasn't their goal. What they truly craved was a reflection of themselves in Violet, a facade of someone who would tolerate their ugliness without resisting. But Violet hadn't given them that satisfaction. Even when her heart broke under the weight of betrayal, she didn't let it destroy her. Instead, she became something stronger, intangible. A force they could not grasp no matter how deep they dug their greedy fingers into her life. Her revenge wasn't loud. It never relied on screaming matches or scenes erupting in confrontation. It was a sequence of quiet, unrelenting moves, like rain carving canyons into stone over centuries. For Logan, consequences stung worst in silence. He had spent years constructing his self-image a successful husband, a brilliant lawyer, a man so clever that even his lies felt polished. But standing in his prison cell, stripped of his suit and cufflinks, Logan had nothing, no admirers, no audience. The man who once planned her demise now sat among strangers. his grandeur reduced to nothing more than the telltale yellow of prison uniforms. They asked him who he'd betrayed, as though expecting drama, but Violet's name wasn't spoken. She knew he didn't dare offer her name to anyone, even in regret. He would swallow her absence like poison until it seeped into his skin, because he no longer controlled her. And that, for Logan, was the real punishment. Brandon wasn't much different. All his manipulations, his schemes, his sneering smile as he side-eyed Logan in hidden conspiracy meetings. They were irrelevant now. No audience applauded him. No accomplices backed his bravado. Power once fed him. But when the power was gone, the only thing left was loneliness. Brandon's charisma, his charm, had rotted the moment truth cracked its veneer. He had nothing but stunned realization, bitter behind prison doors, where moments of pondering his failures rushed and multiplied with exponential cruelty. Violet never visited him, not out of anger but indifference. He didn't deserve to hear her voice. Let the silence speak louder than she ever could. And Whitmore. He sat in the deepest abyss of them all, cut off from his network, his conspiracies lying in permanent disarray. This man, a psychiatrist who preyed on souls rather than healing them, was abandoned in every sense of the word. His estranged daughter, Rachel, showed him no kindness apart from dealing his final defeat. She didn't move toward forgiveness, nor did she linger in anger. In a way, she embodied Violet's philosophy entirely. Revenge need not be rage, but absolute resolution. Whitmore had become a relic, an echo of a man whose existence felt barely worth remembering. If anything, his name now floated as a cautionary tale in legislative circles, bound to the criminal web that Violet unraveled. But Violet's victory wasn't about them. It wasn't about their collapse. Even as poetic as it was to see the empire of lies crumble under its own weight, she could stand for hours recounting their punishments, casting them over the span of time like a storyteller at work, but none of it mattered, not in the deeper sense. Because for Violet, real triumph wasn't about who fell, it was about who rose, quietly, almost imperceptibly. She had become immeasurable. No longer desperate for validation, for recognition, for someone to believe in her hurt. She held her power now in dignity, in knowing that validation was as fleeting as applause. And you? Would you have held your breath so long? Would your hands have waited patiently while justice, like water through cracks, found its own path? Can revenge be something quiet, something unemotional yet profound? There's something sacred about silence after the noise fades. Isn't there a stillness so heavy it feels eternal? Logan's betrayal reverberated through walls, no longer his to own. Brandon paced, but there was nowhere left to run. And Whitmore, he held nothing but the echo of footsteps walking away. Rachel, Violet, the souls they damaged, all walking away. Violet didn't need their apologies. She didn't need her name etched in their minds as a grave warning. She merely stood in her home, her hands unclenched, her breaths deeper now than they'd ever been before. Forgiveness wasn't necessary, but freedom was. The light caught the quiet room, and she felt reborn not through words or validation, but through distance. The ring she once wore, its glittering surface deceptive, sat forgotten on the floor, unworthy of either anger or reverence. Some endings don't need sound. Some victories don't require proclamation. They stand in stillness, sacred and immeasurable, their weight left for others to discover. And perhaps you, too, can learn to win without shouting. Some battles ask only for silence.